Welcome. My name is Bob Tickelman. I'm a Microsoft Principal Technical Trainer, and I'm excited to be your guide for this Module 3, Implementing Azure App Configurations, as part of our secure application development in AZ-204. When you take a look at application development, especially in the modern world of microservices and features like feature flagging, the ability to maintain configuration across a globally diverse and deployed application becomes absolutely critical. We're going to take a look at an Azure service called the Azure App Configuration Service as a tool to be able to automate and provide consistency, reliability across the deployment of your applications on a global basis. So we're going to take a look at implementing these features. And specifically, I want to articulate why this is important. We'll take a look at the different components that are involved, and then we're going to go through things like feature flagging and how we can control that using the app config options. I'm going to go to a whiteboard for a bit and just talk about some of these features, what feature flagging is, why it's important, and why app configuration consistently deployed is going to be important for us to work with. And then I'll come back to the slides and we'll finish up the module. Now I'm going to jump around a little bit just to kind of cover off some topics, and we've seen some of these in other recordings. When you take a look at a modern application design of microservices, and this is the first time you're seeing it, this is an application fictitiously that I've got that has got the triangles representing my front end or system of engagement. I got my middle tier, and I've got my back end represented by the bottom, those squares. And each color shape represents a different part of a microservice that makes up that tier of applications. We've talked about permissions of each application now having its own permissions set that it's working with to be able to now control an application that has its own identity. And we talked about different flows, that if a user uses an application, that the user might have full control to something, but the application only has read capabilities. You're going to get the deprecated version of read through that application. All these different pieces come together. But what now happens as well, across the entirety of a DevOps environment using a CI/CD pipeline, we're going to have multiple versions of products being deployed from dev to test to QA to staging. So I've got potentially 5 different environments of every single component of my application and different settings that have to happen throughout. Because maybe you're making a connection string to a SQL database in dev for the dev version of the application, but in production it's connecting to a SQL server. So all these configuration values need to find a way to automate it. I just want to talk a little bit about what this means to us as we go through. Now, you're seeing, and I'm going to zoom in here for just a bit, but I've got version 22 currently in production, and I'm using a feature called feature flagging. So I've got my code v22 of red triangle running in production, and it's got my code that makes up the application. And there's certain configuration values you do not want to put in the code itself. Like if I needed to make a connection string to a SQL database and I needed secure information to do that, you don't want to put that information into your code, because if the code gets compromised or it gets compiled from someplace in a code repository, that secure information is potentially at risk. And so what we have is typically a config file that passes values and attributes into your application. And as you move from one environment to the other, you're going to be able to change that configuration file without having to compile your code. Now, I've got an example here of a thing called feature flagging. So I'm saying if F1 equals new, then I'm going to run the new site. Else, if old, I'm going to run the old website. So I could actually have the flag in my config file set to old. So I can actually deploy code to production running the old code because I know it works. But I've also got, and you hear the term, I'm testing in production. I've actually got new code in production, and all I have to do is flip this flag from old to new, and all of a sudden, as it runs that code, it's going to run the new version of the site. Now, we've talked about ways to do this using other features like deployment slots and swapping things back and forth, but this is a very common way to deploy applications and get new code into production. Now, if it works, that's great. Now what you want is the next version of the code that's coming through removes that feature flag, the if then else, and it just runs the new version of the code. But if it's not working very well, I just change the flag back to old, and I now don't have to redeploy code. It's now working the old code in production, and then I have to fix this and deploy a new version that's going to come along and eventually work with this. So feature flagging, something that's been done for a long time, and I want to make a case of why this is important that we manage this. You think that it's a simple topic, but I'm going to bring up the use case that we all refer to, and it refers to a company called Knight Capital. And in a little over 90 minutes, they lost over $460 million because of the topic that we're covering right now. They didn't do, and they broke all the rules. It's not like we found this out through Knight Capital. These topics that we're going to cover are well known, and they just didn't implement them. So Knight Capital was a trading company that bought and sold stock on small changes on the price of that stock at high volumes, and that's where they made their money, and they did it through a lot of automation. Now, they didn't manage feature flags very well, and what they did is they broke, as I said, all these rules. So if you want to take some information, take a look at this article by Martin Fowler. He's an ex-Microsoft employee that details at length the process of what went wrong in this process. Now, what they had done is they had used feature flags, similar to what I've talked about here, and they had deployed this application across a large number of servers. Now, I've given an example of maybe it's a geographically deployed application. I've got something in Asia, got something in North America, and something in EMEA. And so I've got V22 of my application that has that feature flag, and I've got the flag set to old on one, I've got it set to new on another, and I got it set to old on a third. So if I don't have this consistently configured, and this is kind of a summary of what happened at Knight Capital, remember they bought and sold stock at a very small change in that stock price at high volumes. And by misusing and reusing and misconfiguring feature flags, they were buying and selling to themselves. And they literally had to go through and turn off the servers to stop this from happening. And in that period of time, that 90 minutes, they bought and sold stock and lost over $460 million. So huge potential issue that we need to make sure that that configuration file that is potentially flagging values and other configuration components are consistently deployed reliably across the multiple environments that we're going to deploy the applications that we're working with, at the scale of applications, with the number of applications we're working with. So all this talks about that capability to manage this. And so we've got an automated method using the app config capability to provide this for you. As I said, it's a fully managed service that can be set up in just a matter of minutes. I'm going to go in and do that in just a second. And it's very simple. It's very similar to a storage account. The key becomes creating the key value pairs, that name value pair of what's the key, what's the value, so that now it can help control the deployment of these values across the environments that you're working with. As I said, you can see all the screens as much as I can read it to you myself. You know, it's a point-in-time replay. You can go back and it has version control that you're working with. So it provides a lot of the things from an enterprise-grade configuration that you're going to look for managing a system as critical as this. And what it does, as opposed to having to have a single file that you're trying to send out, it provides this synchronization capability, making sure that it's consistently deployed through all the locations. So I'm going to switch out and just go back to the portal and create an app config environment. So creating the app configuration capability, much like many of the other resources that we've been doing this series, I have to have a subscription to bill it to. I have to deploy it to a resource group. It is a regionally based resource. So I want you to think of this almost like storage. It's going to have some locations. Remember, not all features are going to be available in all regions, but this is a fairly simple service. So it's going to go to US West 2. What is my resource name? RJBT AZ-204. We have different pricing tiers that give us different capabilities, from replications, amount of storage that you're dealing with. I'm going to pick a standard here. Am I going to replicate this geographically across all of the Azure regions that I'm working with? We talked about access keys, and that's where this module is coming from, is who's going to have access to this information, who's going to be able to come in and use the app config. And we talked about in Key Vault, that separation of control, who has the ability to manage the app config service itself, and then who has the ability to change the attributes inside of the app config. We want to make sure that we have two different methods and that separation of control to make sure that we have less likelihood of potentially having a compromise of the information in the app config environment. I'm not going to go through all the tabs, but just create the resource. So I want to demonstrate a number of the settings that we've talked about or we'll be talking about through the course. I want to point out this first one is you'll see that the endpoint to the app configuration is publicly accessible, and it goes back to that naming convention and making it globally unique. And you can use DNS to actually take that and make it something more specific to your needs. What I want to do is I'm going to jump out to a network segment, and I'm going to show you how to create a private endpoint, which is that topic. So I'm going to come up into 204. I've got a VNet here, so I'm just going to show you a virtual network. And you'll see that I've got a series of subnets in this virtual network. So this is a front end, a business tier. So if you're going to deploy an application that you wanted to be able to control some of the features that we've talked about, and I'm going to go in and show you how to create feature flags and some of those values, you'll see that there's nothing currently deployed in any of these VNets. So I've got all the IP addresses available. I'm going to come into the business network, and you'll see that it's got the address of 10.0.2.0/24. Going back into the app config blade, I'm going to come down under the settings. First thing I want to check is networking. And so this is automatically set up to have the public address. I'm going to change it to private access. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a private connection. I come to the AZ-204. I go. You can call this whatever you want. I'm going to go to the same region. You'll see that the resource, it should find the target network in that same region. So in the AZ-204 virtual network. And you can see those three subnets that I talked about, front end, business tier. So I'm going to have this app config for managing the business applications. I can do all the network configuration. I'm going to keep it fairly simple. Okay, so we've got the resources deployed now. I'm going to go back to the VNet, and I'm going to show you that there is now an IP address that is actually going to show you the resources that have been deployed in there, so you can see the private endpoint. So I'm going to come back into my AZ-204 VNet. I'm going to come into my subnets. And you can now see that I've gone from 251 down to 250 because I now have a connected resource. And if I come down and take a look at the connected resources, you'll see that that private endpoint has got an IP address, and I had it dynamically get a DHCP address, or you could give it a specific address if you wanted to. So that's just showing you those network features. So we're going to be focusing around some of the configuration of protecting your app config. Hopefully I was able to make a case for why this is so important, because you're going to be able to feature flag, throughout the various deployment slots that you might have, or the environments that you're working with. You want to make sure that this information stays pretty safe. So we've taken a look at an identity. We've mentioned this in other recordings. We can use a system assigned managed identity. It's currently off. I simply just click on, and it's now going to create a system assigned managed identity that we can use to now have this app config utility have an identity that could use to maybe possibly get secure information, say from a key vault. It has an identity now that it's going to be able to use, and we can assign permissions to it. We talked about encryption, and by default, Microsoft encrypts all this information for you. using those standard default configurations of AES-256. And I can get into a custom managed keys, and of course talked a bit about how you could then go over and take your own encryption and provide that capability for you. Now, that's all part of the configuration and the setup. I want to get into the actual management of the keys. So let's get into the operations. And we're going to come into the feature manager. So it's inside of the feature manager that you're going to be able to create these flags, these app config settings that you want to work with. We talked about there's general app config features or feature flags. So you can work with variants or feature flags themselves. I'm going to create a feature flag, and I've already got one out there that we can take a look at after it's been created. So do you want to enable the feature flag feature? What is the flag that you want to call it? You can use whatever naming convention. Now, if you follow the documentation around feature flagging, this is not necessarily for app config. You want to have a strict naming convention you want to use, and you do not want to reuse them. It's what causes that Nike Capital situation where they had long-running feature flags that were in place, and they actually ended up reusing feature flags that were previously used. So I'm going to call this FF002, because my first one was 001, some naming convention that is going to try and give you some flexibility to make them globally unique. You have a label for in recording demo. And you'll see there's not much you have to go through. We can create a filter right now. I'm not going to do that. Apply this. And I've got my 002. I can now get in and enable the feature flag. Is it going to be on or off in the characteristics? And then you enable the flag for being deployed, yes or no. So I'm going to come into the one that I already have. We'll show you some of the settings that we have around the feature flag. So you get into the variances. So I have the feature flag. It has just a very simple name. So there's my flag variant. And I can now turn on what are the switches that I want to be able to enable. So this was just a simple feature flag of turning it on or off. And that feature flag would, in my example, if it's on in production, it's going to use the old code. And if it's off, it's going to use the new code possibly. So you can actually set these up. You can say what the default value is, the telemetry. And so you'd come through and configure what the variants are going to have, the values that they're going to have that go along with it, and what you want to default to be, so that you can then flag that and change it and provide the automation to have that be deployed throughout your infrastructure. Okay, so let's go back into the course material and pick up from there. Hopefully I've been able to explain why app configuration is such an important part. Now, there's many attributes that can be used within the app configuration capabilities, and not just feature flags. I've split that out specifically because of how dramatic it is. But the app configuration service provides this capability to manage it globally at scale for you and provide security and consistency and automation. And so you can read a bunch of the stuff on the slide. I'm not going to drain it off, but it provides a whole series of benefits, calling out a couple of them. We're going to show you how you can encrypt that information, because you don't want somebody accidentally getting in and potentially changing those flags and the config settings. So the security around the application is great, but the configuration is going to be very important. We'll be covering that off in just a few more slides. So taking a look at this process, we then take a look at the ability to do this through a wide variety of SDKs that are available to you, depending on which language you want to work with. But the configuration and automation is going to be able to be provided through these libraries to be able to configure these values with the key value pairs. That key value pair is going to be the config value that you're looking with, the key, and then what value you want to associate it with it. Now, it can be configured in one of two ways. There's a flat structure or a hierarchical name structure. To the application, it doesn't make any difference. It's a string of characters that gets passed off to it. Now, it does make it a little bit easier if you use the hierarchical structure, because it puts a delimiter inside of that string, making it easier to do all sorts of things like, doing a search against the key value pairs, trying to find values that meet a specific filtering criteria. We talked about feature flagging specifically, and so now there's a specific interface for the management of the feature flag and the feature managers, and then the filters you're working with it. So in addition to just standard configuration values, the feature flags we've taken a look at. So each flag has these two parts, the name and the list of one or more of the filters that you want to work with. You can actually have filter flags that have multiple filters that could be then searched for. It traverses the entire list of them till it finds one that makes the determination of whether that flag should be enabled or not. And it supports the features of the app settings.json file and configuration features for the feature flags. When you take a look at encrypting the configuration information, this can be done. There's some elementary things that you need to do first. So from a customer perspective, you need to enable customer managed key capacity. You're going to have a standard tier Azure App Service account or instance created. You're going to want to go into the key vault with soft delete and purge protection enabled on that. We covered key vaults in a previous recording in here. And you're going to want either an RSA or an RSA-backed HSM, hardware security module, at the key vault you're dealing with. We've talked about this in other components as well. Taking a look at the app config, you're going to use a managed identity, whether it be a system assigned or a user assigned managed identity to the config instance, and you then want to grant the identity the permissions. The app config information and the service is addressable through a URI. You can see the endpoint is publicly addressable. Again, probably not a very good idea to have that. What they're talking about is a thing called a private endpoint. A private endpoint is a way to extend a Azure service as opposed to making it publicly addressable. You can now project that service as an IP address inside of the subnet where the application is going to be designed. So I just want to draw that up for you for a second. So if you take a look at accessing your app config information, I just showed you that it is publicly addressable. You don't want to have, whether it's a virtual machine, whether it's an app service plan, whether it's a container, you don't want it to have to traverse that HTTP communication. A private endpoint is a way to attach a service or a capability in Azure and project it as if it was a network card inside of a subnet, getting an IP address, so 10.1.2. Might be 220, whatever is a valid IP address on that subnet. So now your service can then access that information by coming to a local private endpoint. That would be the preferred method, as using the private endpoint to connect to the Azure App Config service. In addition to the network security, we then want to provide identities, and we've already talked about having system assigned managed identities that you could then use to assign to the apps and then the configuration values inside of them and pairing them up so that we have a secure closed loop, that it is all within the network of Azure, and it's only going to use identities to be able to get in and work with this. So this is going to break us up into a lab where you can go off and perform these activities.
In this lab, we're going to create an Azure App Configuration resource using the Azure CLI, and then build a .NET console application that uses the configuration builder to retrieve configuration values. I'm going to start by creating some variables for the resource group name, the location where I'm going to deploy them, and then the app config service itself. I've gone right into the Cloud Shell environment. I didn't have to do any configuration. I've been here before, but if this is your first time in here, you would have been asked to set up your Cloud Shell environment. I'm just echoing back the variable value for the app config name. I'm now going to confirm that the Microsoft App Config provider is actually registered to the subscription. This is the command that's going to create the app config service. I'm going to use this to get the user principal name. This will represent who the role will be assigned to. This is going to retrieve the resource ID for the app configuration service. And this is the command that is going to create and assign the app config data reader role. This is going to store the placeholder connection string. These commands are going to create a directory to contain the project and changes into that directory. This is going to create the new .NET console application. These commands added the Azure.identity and the Microsoft extension.configuration.Azure App Config packages to the project. This command is going to open up the Cloud Shell to begin editing the application. I'm now going to go through and replace the blank text with the text I need for the application. I'm going to go get the app config name that I'm going to replace in the code. I'm going to save these changes and exit. I'm now going to run the application, and it's going to echo back the connection string. You can see that there. Let's return to the recording.
So welcome back from the lab. We're going to close out this module when we take a look at question number 1, which is which type of encryption does Azure App Config use to encrypt data at rest? Go ahead and pause the screen. So it uses AES 256-bit encryption available from Microsoft. That's that full encrypted at rest that we talk about across a lot of our Azure storage locations. Question number 2, which operation evaluates the state of a feature flag? Go ahead and pause the screen. The operation that evaluates the state of the feature flag is the filter that you assign. And so you can have a multi-state filter that would then go through and identify a possible configuration to say, does the flag turn on or turn off? So this closes out module number 3, where we took a look at the app config feature that allows for an automated, centralized location to control features like feature flag and app configuration data that could be used, especially in a microservice environment, to manage a large-scale set of configuration data across a wide variety of environments. We saw that the app config also had the capability of having the specific capability to manage with feature flagging capabilities. We saw that we could encrypt that information and secure it through a number of methods by locking down the storage location using your own keys and a set of identities using the system assigned and managed identities, which we covered earlier in the learning path. We saw in a separate module the whole idea around those managed identities as a new type of service principle that you had available that had this capability to have a system assigned managed identity that has a one-to-one relationship that has the same life cycle as the application that it was created for. And we don't have to worry about managing the identity because when the application is deleted or removed, the associated identity is also deleted. We saw that that varied from the user-assigned managed identity, which had the capability to have the identity be used across a variety of locations, if that is a requirement that you're looking for from an application. And now they don't share that common life cycle, so it does mean that you have to maintain the identity in a different life cycle than the applications themselves. And we started the whole thing off with Key Vault. Key Vault has a secure location, and we also used it as part of our encryption and storage of the safe information in the app config feature. Key Vault provides a secure, safe location to store, monitor the use of, and manage the lifecycle around secure information like certificates, secrets, and passwords. All of that information can live in the Key Vault and then be monitored for the usage of that resource. So that brings us to an end to secure development environments available through Azure services. Thank you for joining me in this recording. I look forward to seeing you in another recording.